I woke up to my dog barking like the house was on fire and found 3 acres of my land covered in someone else's trash. If you love watching entitled HOA tyrants get exposed by their own arrogance, subscribe now, because what my camera's caught is going to make your blood boil. I woke up to my dog barking like the house was on fire. When I walked outside, my entire back field was covered in garbage bags, dozens of them ripped open, trash scattered across 3 acres of land I'd spent years keeping clean. I had no idea yet that the woman responsible lived less than 200 feet away, and that she'd been doing this for months. If you love watching entitled HOA members get exposed and destroyed by their own arrogance, subscribe now, because what my hidden camera's caught is going to make your blood boil. I bought my property specifically because it backed up against a small HOA subdivision, but sat just outside their boundary lines. 5 acres, mostly open field, with a small creek running along the back edge. I wasn't part of their association. Never had been. Different zoning, different everything. I liked the space. I liked the privacy. What I didn't like was discovering, roughly 2 years after moving in, that my backfield had slowly become somebody's personal dumping ground. It started small enough that I almost didn't notice. A few stray bags near the tree line, close enough to the HOA fence that I assumed the wind had carried them from somewhere else. I'd pick them up, toss them in my own trash bin, and move on with my day. But it kept happening. Week after week, more bags, always in roughly the same spot, always close to that back fence line separating my property from the subdivision. I started paying closer attention, and that's when I noticed something that made the wind excuse impossible to believe anymore. The bags weren't just randomly scattered like something blown by weather. They were placed, set down deliberately, sometimes even neatly stacked, like someone had walked out, dropped them, and walked right back inside without a second thought. I mentioned it to my neighbor on the other side, an older woman who'd lived in the area for almost 20 years. She sighed the moment I brought it up. "Let me guess," she said. "Trash near the creek line close to the fence? How did you know that?" "Because it's not the first time," she said. "People who live in that HOA get charged extra for going over their weekly trash limit. Cheaper for some of them to just toss the excess over the fence than pay the fee." I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling something shift from confusion into genuine anger. People were using my private property as an illegal dumping ground specifically to avoid a small extra fee on their own trash bill. I decided that week to set up trail cameras, the same kind hunters use to track deer movement, positioned to cover the exact stretch of fence line where the bags kept appearing. I wasn't interested in confrontation yet. I just wanted proof, something concrete enough to bring to whoever might actually care. I didn't have to wait long. For days after installing the cameras, I woke up to my dog going absolutely wild, barking at the back door like something was seriously wrong. I walked outside expecting maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. Instead, I found my entire back field transformed overnight. Not a few stray bags this time. Dozens, ripped open, spilled across nearly 3 acres, trash caught in the tall grass, scattered by wind and animals who'd clearly gotten into it overnight looking for food. I stood there in my pajamas, staring at what looked like an actual landfill spread across land I'd spent years maintaining, feeling something between disbelief and pure rage settle into my chest. This wasn't a wind-blown accident anymore. This wasn't even a single frustrated neighbor tossing excess trash over a fence. Someone had deliberately dumped an enormous amount of garbage onto my property overnight, and whatever camera footage I'd captured was about to show me exactly who. I walked straight to my laptop, pulled up the trail camera footage from the night before, and watched something that made my hands shake with anger. A woman walking calmly along the fence line at nearly midnight, carrying bag after bag from a small utility cart, dumping them methodically onto my land like she'd done this exact routine dozens of times before. I paused the footage, zooming in on her face, and that's when I recognized her immediately. Not a random resident, not some anonymous neighbor avoiding a trash fee. The HOA board president herself. I sat frozen in front of my laptop, staring at the paused footage of the HOA board president dumping trash onto my property in the middle of the night, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Her name was Carol Whitfield. I knew her by reputation before I ever knew her by face, the kind of HOA president residents whispered about at the mailbox, known for aggressive fines over minor violations and a general reputation for making life miserable for anyone who dared question her authority. I scrubbed back through weeks of footage, and what I found made my stomach turn. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. The cameras had captured her doing this exact routine no fewer than 11 times over the past month alone. Always late at night. Always the same utility cart. Always the same methodical, practiced movements of someone who'd clearly convinced herself she'd never get caught. I called my neighbor again, the older woman who'd first mentioned the trash fee theory, and described what I'd found. Carol Whitfield, she said, her voice sharp with disbelief. The HOA president? You're telling me she's the one dumping trash on your land? I have video of her doing it 11 separate times. I said. There's a long pause. That woman fined my daughter $300 last year for leaving her trash cans out an extra 6 hours past pickup day. $300. And she's been illegally dumping garbage this entire time? The irony wasn't lost on me. Someone who'd built an entire reputation punishing residents for minor trash-related infractions was apparently breaking a far more serious law herself, regularly, without a single moment of hesitation. I decided my next move needed to be careful. I wasn't interested in a shouting match at my fence line. I wanted this documented properly, handled through actual legal channels, something that would stick instead of dissolving into another neighborhood argument nobody remembered accurately a month later. I called the county's code enforcement office first, describing the situation and asking what my options were for illegal dumping on private property. The woman on the phone sounded almost surprised by how clear-cut the case was. If you have video evidence showing a specific individual dumping waste on your property without permission, that's actually a pretty serious offense. Illegal dumping charges can include significant fines and, depending on the volume, potentially even misdemeanor charges. What kind of fines are we talking about? Per incident, it can range anywhere from $500 to several $1,000s, depending on the volume and whether it's a repeat offense, she said. And based on what you're describing, 11 separate incidents would each be treated individually. I did quick math in my head. 11 incidents, potentially thousands of dollars each. This wasn't just an embarrassing situation for Carol Whitfield anymore. This was a financial disaster waiting to happen, entirely of her own making. I gathered every piece of footage organized by date and timestamp, along with photos I took that same morning documenting the sheer scale of trash scattered across my field. I filed an official report with County Code Enforcement, attaching everything as evidence. 3 days later, an investigator called to schedule a site visit, wanting to see the scope of the dumping firsthand and review the footage in detail before proceeding further. I hadn't told anyone else in the neighborhood yet, wanting to let the official process play out properly before word spread. But apparently, someone already knew something was happening, because 2 days after filing my report, I received an unexpected knock at my front door. Carol Whitfield stood there, dressed impeccably as always, holding a small basket that looked suspiciously like a peace offering. I wanted to apologize, she said, before I'd even fully opened the door. There's clearly been some kind of misunderstanding about trash accumulating near the property line. I stared at her, genuinely surprised by her audacity. A misunderstanding? I have video of you personally dumping trash on my land 11 times over the past month. Her expression shifted instantly, the polished friendliness disappearing in a fraction of a second, replaced by something colder, more calculating. I think you're mistaken about what you saw, she said carefully. But regardless, I'm sure we can handle this privately neighbor to neighbor without involving unnecessary outside parties. It's a little late for private, I said. I already filed a report with County Code Enforcement 3 days ago. Her face went completely pale. Carol's expression shifted from calculated calm into genuine panic in the span of about 2 seconds. The basket she'd been holding lowered slightly, like she'd suddenly forgotten why she'd brought it in the first place. "You already filed a report?" she said, voice noticeably tighter than before. With video evidence, I said, 11 separate incidents, all time-stamped, all showing your face clearly. "That footage could be interpreted many different ways," she said quickly, grasping for some kind of foothold. "Lighting conditions at night, camera angles, it's not as conclusive as you think." "You're welcome to make that argument to the county investigator," I said. "He's scheduled to review everything in person next week." Something in her face changed at that moment, like she'd suddenly realized arguing with me wasn't going to accomplish anything. She left without saying much else, walking back toward the HOA subdivision with noticeably less confidence than she'd arrived with. I should have felt satisfied in that moment. Instead, I felt something closer to unease, the kind of feeling you get when you sense a situation is about to escalate rather than resolve quietly. I was right to feel that way. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from an attorney representing Carol Whitfield, claiming the trail camera footage had been obtained illegally, violating her privacy rights, and threatening legal action if I didn't immediately withdraw my complaint and destroy all recorded footage. I forwarded the letter straight to a property attorney a friend had recommended, a sharp woman named Rachel who specialized in exactly these kinds of disputes. "This is nonsense," Rachel said after reviewing everything. "Trail cameras positioned on your own private property, capturing activity occurring on your own private property, are completely legal. There's no reasonable expectation of privacy when someone is trespassing to illegally dump garbage on land that isn't theirs." So, her lawyer's just bluffing? "Essentially, yes," Rachel said. "This is a common intimidation tactic, hoping you'll back down before the county investigation moves forward. Don't respond directly. Let me handle communication with her attorney from here." Rachel sent a firm, professionally worded response, citing relevant privacy law, and confirming the footage remained fully admissible evidence for the ongoing investigation. Carol's attorney went quiet after that, no further threatening letters arriving in the days that followed. But the silence didn't last long. Word had apparently spread through the HOA subdivision faster than Carol probably wanted, because within a week, I started noticing something new during my morning walks along the fence line. Other neighbors, ones I didn't personally know, stopping their cars near my property, watching me with curious, sometimes sympathetic expressions, occasionally even rolling down windows to ask quiet questions about what was actually happening. One woman, probably in her 60s, stopped one morning and asked directly, "Is it true Carol's been dumping trash on your land this whole time?" "There's video evidence. If that answers your question," I said. She shook her head slowly. "That explains so much. Our trash bill went up last year because the county said our subdivision kept exceeding waste limits. Half the neighborhood assumed people were just being careless. Guess we know where at least some of that excess was actually going." That detail hit me harder than I expected. Carol hadn't just been avoiding a small personal fee. She'd been contributing to an entire subdivision's rising waste costs, while presumably still enforcing strict, aggressive fines against residents for minor trash violations of their own. The hypocrisy of the situation kept deepening the more people came forward with their own stories. A family fined heavily for accidentally leaving a single trash bag outside bin hours. An elderly resident threatened with legal action over a minor recycling violation. All of it enforced by someone secretly dumping garbage onto her neighbor's private property to avoid consequences of her own. The county investigator's site visit finally happened the following Tuesday, walking the full scope of the dumped trash with me, reviewing every timestamp of footage in careful detail, documenting everything with an expression that grew increasingly serious the longer he spent examining the evidence. "This is about as clear-cut as illegal dumping cases get," he told me before leaving. "Given the volume and repeated nature of this, I'd expect formal charges to move forward fairly quickly." 2 weeks later, Carol Whitfield was formally charged. 11 counts of illegal dumping, combined potential fines exceeding $15,000. But the charges themselves weren't even the most damaging consequence waiting for her. Because once residents discovered the full scope of what she'd been doing, an emergency HOA meeting was scheduled. And Carol wasn't just facing county charges anymore. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening, and word had spread through the subdivision fast enough that the community clubhouse ended up completely packed, residents standing along the walls once the chairs ran out. I wasn't a member of the HOA, so I hadn't planned on attending, but Rachel suggested I show up anyway, given that the meeting directly involved evidence I'd provided and a situation that had originated entirely on my own property. Carol sat at the front of the room, noticeably smaller somehow than the confident, polished woman who'd once threatened $300 fines over trash cans left out a few hours too long. Her attorney sat beside her, though based on his expression, even he seemed to understand there wasn't much left to salvage. The meeting opened with the vice president, a quiet man named Harold who'd apparently been waiting years for a moment like this, reading a prepared statement summarizing the county investigation's findings. 11 documented incidents of illegal dumping, video evidence clearly identifying Carol Whitfield as the individual responsible, formal criminal charges already filed by the county, with potential fines exceeding $15,000. The room went completely silent as residents absorbed the full scope of what their board president had actually been doing night after night, while simultaneously enforcing some of the strictest, most aggressive trash-related fines the subdivision had ever seen. One resident stood up almost immediately, an older man whose voice shook slightly with barely restrained anger. "She fined me $400 last spring," he said, "for accidentally leaving my recycling bin at the curb one extra day after a family emergency. Meanwhile, she's been dumping actual garbage onto someone else's private land for months." Another resident stood, a young mother holding a sleeping toddler. "She threatened legal action against my family over a single missed trash pickup fee. We paid it immediately because we were terrified of what she might do otherwise." Story after story poured out, each one revealing another layer of the same pattern. Aggressive fines, threatening letters, legal intimidation over genuinely minor infractions, all enforced by someone who'd apparently decided the rules simply didn't apply to her own behavior. Carol sat through all of it without saying much, her earlier confidence completely evaporated, replaced by the kind of stunned silence that comes from realizing an entire community has finally seen through years of carefully maintained authority. When she finally spoke, her voice was noticeably smaller than before. "I understand people are upset," she said, "but I've dedicated years of my life to this community, keeping standards high, maintaining property values. By dumping trash on someone else's property," Harold interrupted, his usually quiet demeanor completely gone, "while fining families hundreds of dollars for far smaller mistakes?" Carol didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one that would have satisfied anyone in that room anymore. Harold called for an emergency vote, immediate removal from her position as board president, effective that same night, along with a formal community statement distancing the HOA from her actions entirely, making clear the dumping had been a personal act, not something sanctioned or hidden by the association itself. The vote wasn't close. Nearly unanimous, hands raised across the room within seconds of the question being asked. Even members who'd sat quietly through the entire meeting lifted their hands without hesitation. Carol stood up before the final count was even announced, gathering her things with shaking hands, her attorney following close behind. She didn't say another word to the room. She didn't need to. The look on her face said everything her voice couldn't. As she walked past me near the exit, she paused for just a moment, long enough to meet my eyes with something that wasn't quite an apology, but wasn't defiance either. "I hope you're satisfied," she said quietly. "I just wanted my land back." I said, "Everything after that was you." She left without responding, walking out into the parking lot alone, her position, her reputation, and whatever authority she'd once held over that community disappearing behind her with every step. But as I drove home that night, I had a feeling this wasn't quite the end of Carol Whitfield's story, because county charges were still pending, and $15,000 in potential fines was about to become the least of her problems. 3 months later, Carol Whitfield's case went before a county judge, and the outcome made it clear just how seriously the system treated 11 documented counts of illegal dumping. The judge reviewed the evidence methodically, timestamp by timestamp, watching footage of Carol arriving at nearly midnight again and again, methodically emptying her utility cart onto land that wasn't hers. Combined with witness testimony from the HOA meeting and the county investigator's detailed report, there wasn't much room for her attorney to argue reasonable doubt. She was found guilty on all 11 counts. The financial penalties came out even higher than the county's initial estimate, once the judge factored in environmental cleanup costs, since some of the dumped waste had included materials requiring specialized disposal rather than standard trash pickup, combined with court costs and mandatory restitution for the cleanup already completed on my property, her total financial obligation came to just over $22,000. But money wasn't the only consequence waiting for her. Given the volume and repeated nature of the offenses, the judge also imposed a permanent injunction, legally barring her from any involvement in HOA leadership positions anywhere in the county for the next 10 years. A detail that made national headlines in a handful of local news outlets covering unusual HOA disputes. I sat in that courtroom listening to the ruling, feeling something settle in my chest that was equal parts relief and quiet vindication. This wasn't really about revenge, even though I understood why it might look that way from the outside. It was about accountability, about someone finally facing real consequences for years of quietly believing rules only applied to everyone else. Word of the ruling spread quickly through the subdivision, and the community's reaction surprised me more than I expected. Instead of division or lingering resentment, most residents seemed to feel something closer to collective relief, like an oppressive weight had finally lifted after years of walking on eggshells around unpredictable, aggressive enforcement. The new HOA board, led by Harold, implemented sweeping changes almost immediately. Trash-related fines were reduced to reasonable, clearly documented amounts, with a formal appeals process for genuine emergencies. All board decisions became publicly recorded and available for resident review. And perhaps most importantly, a clear, transparent code of conduct was established.